All right, Auto 2, good morning. It's another bad hair day, but it's all right. We're going to talk about fuel system um, supply components, tanks, filters, lines, those kinds of things. And we'll do this pretty quick. So a fuel tank assembly is usually under the trunk or back seat, but outside the car. It's usually made of sheet metal or plastic, and I've seen as low as 10-gallon tanks, and I've seen as high as 42-gallon tanks, believe it or not. My 92 Suburban, which has the towing package, is a 42-gallon capacity. When I fill up for gas in that thing, me life flashes before me eyes, okay? So you can see the tank, and there's actually quite a bit more to it than you might think. A bunch of lines, vapor lines, fuel sending unit, possibly a filter, an intake fuel pump, a bunch of things. So let's look a little more closely at it. So here you have a fuel tank assembly. These are the components that we're going to think about. Sorry, here it comes. There we go. Nope, sorry, we went too far, Mr. L. And now there we go. So we've got a fuel tank filler neck, this guy here, for filling the tank. And it's obvious, many times they're going to have what they call a spillback ball that prevents leaking during filling. In the early 70s, we put a restrictor in here so that the larger tetraethyl lead regular gasoline nozzles would not fit in there. That's kind of a thing of the past. So there used to be a different size and nozzle diameter. Unleaded was smaller. Anyways, there's a restrictor in here. It's something we have to check on the smog test. We're testing all the way back to 1976. And so on. So we got this fuel filler neck and a spillback ball. And we will have a cap that's sealed to prevent vapor escape. We don't vent to the atmosphere anymore because we don't want unburned hydrocarbons evaporating when the car's sitting there in the sun and going out into the environment. There's baffles inside the tank, so as we go ride around town, the fuel doesn't slosh to one side, and then we have a supply problem because it sloshes to one side and we don't pick it up. So they put baffles, little metal baffles, and down inside the tank to keep the fuel from sloshing away from the pickup. We have steel straps on the outside to bolt the thing in. Usually there's two steel straps. Take two bolts out and the tank comes down. We've got a sending unit inside, and this is a variable resistor, and I'll show you one right here. It's a variable resistor that's used to tell the fuel tank level. This one looks like it's been chewed on by a rat or something. I don't know what, but anyways, this is a float. Let me get you in the picture here. That goes up when the fuel level's up and goes down when it's down. And it moves a variable resistor right here to change the level of fuel on your gauge on the dash. This one's a modern car one with an in-tank electric fuel pump, a little fuel sock to filter out any large particles that your buddy throws in your gas tank, things like that. Okay. So then we've got a tank pressure sensor. Starting in 1996, we put a tank pressure sensor in our tank systems for what we call evaporative emissions testing. So we don't want fuel vapors to leak the environment. So starting in 96, part of the software of an OBD2 PCM, powertrain control module, is to test the fuel system to make sure there's no leaks. So we either pull a vacuum on it or we pressurize it, and the pressure sensor tells us if there's any leaks. If there are, it turns on the check engine light and says you have a PO 455 or 456 small leak or large leak, etc. Common one I just discovered recently on Toyotas is the having the fuel cap cause a small leak, turning on the check engine light. Okay. All right. So next is fuel tank straps. So we've got these big, thick steel straps bolting that in. A lot of cars will have a plastic or a steel girdle that goes underneath that tank to keep any debris from the road from damaging or puncturing the tank. Okay. So this is showing a pickup sending unit in the tank. And there's our float right here, float arm. There's the variable resistor. There's our fuel sock that's going to suck fuel up. And it says the sock strains out debris in the tank. And then to kind of show the fuel gauge operation, here's a tank where the fuel's low and the float's down. Here's a tank where the fuel's high and the float's up. And the way they do it is you have current going through this coil of wire, which creates a magnetic field based on and moves the needle down or moves the needle up. The variable resistor determines how much current flows through these coils, which determines the magnetism to pull the needle over or not. Actually, I apologize. I said magnetism. It's not. You can see heat actually bends it. So it's a heat-sensitive expansion contraction unit that pulls the needle over. Okay. Now that's probably older fuel tank gauges. Not so much the case today, but anyways, gives you an idea of how they work. So fuel lines and fuel hoses are going to carry fuel from the tank to the engine. The fuel lines are steel tubing or synthetic rubber. And you can see the tank here, and you can see you got lines going all the way up. This one's a 4-cylinder port fuel injected. You can see the 1, 2, 3, 4 injectors there. And keep going here. Sorry, had to pause there for a moment. So fuel lines, fuel return line. Many cars have a fuel return line, not all. But that fuel return line is going to carry excess fuel back to the tank. It keeps the cool fuel constantly flowing through the system. We don't want the fuel to get hot. We want it to stay cold. Now we have what's called returnless systems. This started around the beginning of the new millennium, where the tank pulses to hold a constant pressure to the injectors. So when fuel injections first came out, we would pressurize the lines and dump excess fuel. So the pump was making more pressure than we needed. We just dumped excess pressure off to the tank, and we had a fuel pressure sending unit on the intake manifold, this one right here, that would hold the pressure at a range somewhere between 30 and 42 psi. Now in returnless systems, what we're doing is we are going ahead and pulsing the pump on and off and just keeping the pressure where we want it. So a little bit about fuel filters. So they're going to stop contaminants from entering the system, and any dirt, rust, or water, etc. And the filter sock, which I already showed you, and here's another one here. This is off a General Motors product, and there's a filter sock right there that's going to screen out any large particles. There's my sending unit there. And inside here is the electric fuel pump. There's the resistor for the fuel level on the gauge. And this seals on the top of the tank. And one thing you can notice, this only has one fuel line coming off. So this one is a returnless system. This one's not going to have a return. So that sock is in the tank to filter out large debris. Then we've usually got a second inline fuel filter used for finer filtration. So what those look like is this, and I've got one here that I've cut apart. They're a metal canister, and I've cut the end off it. And there's the paper element inside. And the paper element is going to filter the fuel down to a certain micron, meaning certain tiny size of opening. So that's what they look like when they're apart. Here's an inline fuel filter for a high pressure fuel injection system, about 40 psi, that sits on the fuel rail. Starting just after the new millennium, the federal government decided that we didn't want fuel filters out anymore. Another source of leak, another source of hydrocarbons going to the environment. So they've just got an intake fuel filter, and changing fuel filters has become a thing of the past unless we're changing the pump. Here's an old school carbureted inline paper filter. Here's another inline filter, another one. This is a fuel injection filter like I just shown you. But it is really important that we keep any debris out of the fuel lines, because if it goes into the injectors with those very, very tiny openings, we can clog something. And then we get a fuel injector that's not spraying right, and then the engine's not running right and maybe causing a misfire. Let's keep going here. So what we've got on here is two types of fuel pumps. First, a mechanical pump for carburation. And again, you could say, Mr. Earl, why are we even talking about carburetors? Because we're still smogging cars 76 and newer, so we still got non-computer controlled carbs on cars in 1976, and then right after that, 78, 79, we got computer controlled carbs, and so on. So these have a mechanical camshaft operated fuel pump. So it's kind of hard to see in the picture, but this is a lobe on the camshaft coming around and actuating that arm. I'll show you a big block Chevy cam. This is a old school push rod overhead valve engine, one camshaft for all 8 cylinders. You can see, intake and exhaust lobes. So there's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lobes on this cam. But then you've got a 17th lobe right here. And it looks different, doesn't have as much of a peak on it like this. This one is for operating the mechanical fuel pump, because this was a early 70s big block Chevy that had a mechanical fuel pump. Here's an intake modern electric throttle body fuel injected or port fuel injected pump and system. There's a sock, there's the pump, there's the cap on the top of the tank. Here's another one. There's the float there, there's a sock there, a little filter, there's a pump there. So usually and by the way, let me go back for a moment. On carbureted cars, we used to run about 3 to 6 PSI and somewhere as high as 10 to 12 PSI of fuel pressure. Here's throttle body or PFI, usually in the tank, 3 types, okay, impeller, roller vane, or sliding pump, and about 30 to 42 and some as high as 90 PSI. The early throttle body injection units, like on my 92 Suburban, ran about 12 to 15 pounds per square inch. Here's a throttle body injection unit from a Ford. This throttle body injection unit ran about 30 to 42 PSI. It was a higher pressure, and there's a little Schrader where I can put my gauge on and measure. It had 2 fuel injectors spraying into a centrally located throttle body. We've talked a little bit about the why that isn't so good. Most all port fuel PFI systems like these, this is a 6-cylinder with 6 individual injectors. These would spray about 30 to 42 PSI. There's a vacuum operated fuel pressure regulator. So fuel comes in, charges up the lines, and based on vacuum, we dump fuel back to the tank to keep our fuel pressure where we want it. At idle, we want it about 30 PSI. Wide open throttle, about 42 PSI. When you rump the throttle down, go to teenager position, vacuum drops. A spring in here pushes the diaphragm down, and we bleed off a minimum amount of fuel, raising the fuel pressure in the lines during wide open throttle. Okay, and one of the nice things is high pressure pump is impervious to hills or vapor lock, meaning vapor lock is where we basically boil the fuel in the lines on a really hot day. Electric fuel pump can push that fuel through. That won't happen. And if I'm a 4-wheel driver and I got a Jeep and I got port fuel injection, even if I'm on a very steep hill, I don't have to worry about fuel sloshing around in a float bowl of a carburetor and starving and killing the engine while I'm on a really steep hill. So we really like throttle body fuel injection or port fuel injection for that reason. Just a little bit about electric pumps, just real simple. There's our engine. Back here is our fuel tank. There's our sock, our pump, and we're pumping up into the engine. And you'll notice there's a charcoal canister, which is part of the evaporative emission system. And it says in this circuit, if the oil pressure drops too low, the switch shuts off the pump. So we've got a oil pressure switch here that will turn the fuel pump off if oil pressure dies. And General Motors does this. It has this on my Suburban, so that if we lose oil pressure, we shut the engine off and we don't damage the engine. Okay, that's it for now.